Actually, there's one more document we need to talk about. That was the moment everything changed. Up until that point, I thought the whole situation with my dad's house was finished. Over. Done. Ryan had made that very clear to everyone in the family, and honestly, for a while, I believed him. I was already halfway out of my chair in the lawyer's office when Mr. Harris said those words. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence, like everyone suddenly realized the conversation wasn't finished after all. I remember glancing across the table at my brother Ryan. For the first time in weeks, he didn't look confident. He looked confused. And looking back now, that was the first real sign that something deeper had been going on the entire time. At that moment, though, I had no idea what was about to unfold. I had walked into that office believing I had already lost the house where my brother and I grew up. The house where my dad spent 30 years building a life for our family. The house that, according to Ryan, was never meant to be mine in the first place. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until a few months ago, I thought I understood my own family pretty well. My dad, Robert Carter, was the kind of guy who believed in keeping things simple. He worked as a contractor most of his life, built half the homes in our neighborhood with his own hands, and lived in the same two-story brick house just outside Columbus, Ohio for almost 3 decades. It wasn't some huge property or anything like that. Just a modest place on about half an acre, with a front porch my dad rebuilt twice and a backyard where he planted the same maple tree the year I turned 10. But to us, it was home. After my dad passed away last winter, everything changed faster than I expected. Losing him was hard enough on its own, but what I didn't expect was how quickly things between me and Ryan would start to shift. Ryan is my older brother, 3 years ahead of me, and growing up he always had a certain way of taking charge of situations. He was confident, decisive, sometimes a little too comfortable speaking on behalf of everyone else. Usually it didn't bother me much. But after the funeral, I started noticing something about the way Ryan handled things that didn't sit right with me. Within days, he was already talking about paperwork, property, and what he called getting the house situation sorted out. At first I assumed we'd handle it together. That seemed obvious. But Ryan never actually said that. Instead, he started talking like decisions had already been made. I remember one afternoon about a week after the funeral when we were sitting at the kitchen table in the house we grew up in. Ryan had a stack of documents spread out in front of him and a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. He didn't even look up when he said it. Dad always intended for me to take care of the house, he told me casually. Just like that. Like it was already settled. At the time, I didn't argue. Not because I believed him completely, but because the whole conversation felt strange. Too sudden. Too confident. Our dad had never said anything like that to me before. But grief does strange things to your judgment. When someone says something with enough certainty, you start wondering if maybe you're the one who missed something along the way. Over the next few weeks, Ryan repeated that same explanation to just about everyone in the family. My Aunt Linda heard it first during Sunday dinner. Then my cousin Mark heard it when he stopped by the house to help Ryan move some of Dad's tools into the garage. Every time Ryan told the story, it sounded a little more official. Like it had always been the plan. According to him, Dad had made it clear that Ryan would inherit the house because he was the older brother and because, in Ryan's words, Daniel's always been more of the free spirit type. I remember the way people nodded when he said that. Not enthusiastically. Just quietly accepting the explanation. Looking back now, that part might have bothered me more than anything else. Nobody actually questioned it. And maybe I should have. But at the time, I stayed quiet. Part of me didn't want to start a fight while we were still dealing with the loss of our dad. Another part of me assumed the truth would eventually sort itself out through the legal process. Ryan told me he had already contacted Dad's lawyer, a man named Jonathan Harris who had handled some property paperwork for our family years earlier. Ryan said the lawyer was reviewing everything and that we'd have an official meeting once the documents were finalized. It's mostly just formalities, Ryan told me more than once. Nothing complicated. The way he said it always sounded reassuring. Almost too reassuring. But I let it go. Weeks passed. The house stayed exactly the way Dad left it. His boots were still by the back door. His old pickup truck still sat in the driveway with the same dent in the tailgate he'd been meaning to fix for years. Every time I walked through those rooms, the whole situation felt heavier. Like something about the story Ryan was telling didn't quite line up with the man I knew our father to be. Still, I didn't push back. Not yet. Because at that point, everyone already seemed to believe Ryan knew exactly what he was talking about. And honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready to challenge that. Then finally, about 6 weeks later, Ryan called me and said the lawyer wanted both of us to come into the office to finalize everything. His exact words were, "We'll wrap this up and move forward." At the time, I thought that meeting was going to close the chapter on the whole situation. I walked into Mr. Harris's office expecting to hear the final confirmation that Ryan had been telling the truth all along. I even told myself that maybe letting go of the house was the right thing to do. But the moment the lawyer looked down at that last document and said those words, the entire story I'd been hearing for weeks suddenly didn't feel so certain anymore. And in that quiet little office, with Ryan sitting across from me at the table, I started to realize something that hadn't crossed my mind before. What if the story Ryan had been telling everyone wasn't the full truth? If I am being honest, the weeks after that first conversation with Ryan were the part of the story that confused me the most. At the time everything seemed normal on the surface, but looking back now I can see how the tone inside our family slowly started to shift without anyone really acknowledging it. After that day at the kitchen table when Ryan first mentioned that Dad had supposedly intended for him to take the house, the subject kept coming up in quiet, almost casual ways. Not arguments. Not confrontations. Just small comments that gradually built the same story over and over again. Ryan would mention things like how much maintenance the house needed, or how expensive the property taxes had become over the years. Sometimes he would say it while we were cleaning out the garage together, other times while we were sitting in the living room going through boxes of Dad's paperwork. Each time he said it, the conclusion was always the same. He was the one who should handle the house. At first I assumed he was just thinking out loud about responsibilities. Ryan had always been the practical one between us. When we were kids he was the one who planned things, organized things, decided things. I was the younger brother who usually followed along. That dynamic had never really bothered me growing up, but now the stakes felt different. This was not about planning a family vacation or deciding who drove the truck. This was the house where our father had lived his entire life. Still, I kept telling myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Ryan said Dad had talked to him about it privately. Maybe he had. It was not impossible. My father had always believed in being direct with people when it came to responsibilities. Maybe he had simply assumed Ryan would be the one to take care of things. But the strange part was the way Ryan spoke about it to everyone else. When our Aunt Linda came by one afternoon with a casserole dish and a stack of old photo albums, Ryan casually told her that Dad had left the house in his care. The way he said it sounded less like a possibility and more like an established fact. Aunt Linda nodded slowly and said something about how it made sense since Ryan lived closer to the property than I did. I remember standing there in the hallway listening to that conversation and realizing that nobody was actually asking questions. The explanation Ryan offered sounded reasonable enough that people simply accepted it. That pattern continued over the next several weeks. Our cousin Mark came by one Saturday to help Ryan sort through some of Dad's tools in the shed behind the house. Ryan told him the same thing. Mark shrugged and said something about how managing a property was a lot of work. Then the conversation moved on to football and weather like nothing unusual had happened. Each time I heard Ryan repeat that explanation, something about it felt slightly more permanent. Like the more often it was said, the more it started to feel true whether it actually was or not. I did not confront him about it. At least not then. Instead, I watched. I listened. I tried to understand why Ryan seemed so certain about something that had never been discussed with me directly. Part of the reason I stayed quiet was because of the timing. We had just buried our father less than 2 months earlier. The last thing I wanted was to turn a family loss into a public argument. My father had always hated that kind of conflict. He believed family disagreements should be handled calmly and privately, not turned into spectacles. So I told myself I would wait until the lawyer meeting Ryan kept mentioning. Ryan, said the lawyer, Jonathan Harris, had already started reviewing the paperwork connected to the property. According to Ryan, there were some standard legal procedures that needed to be finalized before the estate could be officially settled. He described it like routine business. Just signatures, confirmations, and a few legal details. Nothing complicated. Every time I asked about the timeline, Ryan had the same answer. The lawyer would call us both when everything was ready. In the meantime, Ryan seemed to take on more control over the house itself. He started organizing Dad's tools in the garage and labeling boxes in the basement. He even replaced the old lock on the front door one afternoon, explaining that it was better to keep things secure while the property situation was being sorted out. None of those actions were unreasonable on their own. If anything, they looked responsible. But the overall picture started to feel strange to me. Ryan was acting less like someone waiting for a legal decision and more like someone who already believed the outcome had been decided. One moment in particular still stands out in my memory. About 3 weeks after the funeral, we were both sitting on the back porch in the evening. The maple tree Dad planted years earlier was casting a long shadow across the yard, and the air smelled like fresh cut grass from the neighbor's lawn. Ryan leaned back in his chair and said something that caught me off guard. He said, "Once everything is finalized, I might think about selling the place." I remember looking at him carefully when he said that. Selling the place had never crossed my mind. That house was tied to nearly every memory of our childhood. The idea of it being sold felt strange, almost disrespectful to the life our father had built there. I asked Ryan if he was serious. He shrugged and said it was just a possibility. According to him, the property value in that area had gone up a lot in recent years and it might make financial sense. Then he added something that I did not fully process until later. He said if he did sell it, he would make sure I received something from the sale. At the time I remember nodding slowly, trying to figure out why that statement made me uncomfortable. It sounded generous on the surface, but something about the wording implied that the decision already belonged to him. That night I drove home with the uneasy feeling that the story surrounding the house had somehow moved forward without my participation. And the strangest part was that everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable with that. The family believed Ryan understood the situation better than anyone else. The lawyer had not contacted me directly yet. The paperwork had not been reviewed together. But somehow the narrative had already taken shape. Looking back now, I realize that was the moment I should have asked more questions. Because by the time the lawyer finally called and asked both of us to come into his office, most people already believed the house belonged to Ryan. And if I am being honest, a small part of me had started to believe it too. The strange thing about situations like this is that tension rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize the atmosphere around you has completely changed. That was exactly what started happening between Ryan and me during the weeks leading up to the lawyer meeting. At first Ryan simply spoke about the house with confidence. But over time his confidence started turning into something else. Something closer to control. It began with small, practical decisions that he made without asking me. One Saturday morning I drove over to the house to pick up a few things from my old bedroom and noticed that the garage had been reorganized. My father had always kept his tools arranged a certain way. Every hammer, every wrench, every box of nails had its own place. Ryan had moved nearly all of it. The shelves were labeled now. The larger equipment was pushed toward the back wall. It looked neat and efficient, but it also felt like something had quietly changed ownership. When I asked Ryan about it, he just shrugged and said he was preparing the place for future maintenance work. Then he added something that stuck with me. He said if he ended up keeping the house, he wanted everything organized properly. The way he said the word "if" sounded almost automatic, like a technical detail rather than a real possibility. As the days passed, similar moments started appearing more frequently. Ryan began scheduling meetings with contractors to get estimates on repairs that the house might need someday. He talked about replacing the aging water heater and updating the electrical panel in the basement. Those were all reasonable ideas, but what caught my attention was the fact that he never asked my opinion about any of it. Instead, he talked about the house like a project he had already taken responsibility for. During one conversation he even said something that felt strangely dismissive. He said, "I know you have your own place and your own life. Managing a property like this would probably be too much for you anyway." He said it casually, almost like he was trying to reassure me. But the message underneath it was clear. He had already decided I was not really part of the equation. I remember standing in the kitchen when he said that, leaning against the counter while he flipped through a notebook filled with repair estimates. Part of me wanted to push back right then. But another part of me hesitated. Ryan had always been good at presenting things as practical decisions rather than personal ones. If I challenged him directly, it would immediately sound like I was creating unnecessary conflict. So again I stayed quiet and told myself the lawyer meeting would eventually clear everything up. Still, something about Ryan's behavior kept bothering me. One afternoon about a month after the funeral, I stopped by the house unexpectedly. Ryan's truck was parked in the driveway, but the front door was locked. That caught my attention because growing up our father almost never locked that door during the day. I knocked and waited a moment before Ryan opened it. When he did, he looked slightly surprised to see me standing there. Inside the living room there were several papers spread across the coffee table. Ryan quickly gathered them together and stacked them into a folder before I could get a good look. I asked him what he was working on and he said he had been reviewing some property documents the lawyer had sent over. The way he said it sounded casual, but the speed with which he cleared the table made the situation feel different. For the first time I wondered whether Ryan had been discussing the legal details with the lawyer privately without including me. Later that same week Ryan called me and said the lawyer wanted us both to come into the office soon. According to him, the estate paperwork was almost finished and we just needed to review a few final documents. His tone on the phone sounded relaxed, but there was something else beneath it that I could not quite identify. Looking back now, it sounded like urgency. As if he wanted the process to move forward quickly. That same urgency appeared again a few days later when he brought up another subject during a family dinner at our Aunt Linda's house. Several relatives were there that evening, including our cousin Mark and Mark's wife, Emily. We were all sitting around the dining table when Ryan mentioned that the lawyer meeting was coming up soon. Then he said something that caught everyone's attention. He said once the paperwork was finalized, he planned to explore selling the house within the next year. The room grew quiet for a moment after he said that. Aunt Linda asked if he was sure that was the right decision. Ryan explained that property values in our neighborhood had increased significantly and that selling could be a smart financial move. Then he looked directly at me and added, "Do not worry. If I sell it, I will make sure Daniel gets something from the sale." The way he said it sounded polite, even generous. But the effect it had on the room was immediate. Everyone at the table suddenly understood the situation in the same way. Ryan was the one making the decision about the house. I was simply someone who might receive a portion of the money later. I remember feeling a strange mix of embarrassment and disbelief sitting there while the conversation moved on. No one argued with Ryan. No one questioned whether that decision should involve both of us. The narrative had already taken hold. By the time dinner ended that evening, the idea that Ryan controlled the future of the house seemed completely normal to everyone else at the table. That moment stayed with me during the drive home that night. It was the first time I truly felt the social pressure surrounding the situation. Challenging Ryan now would not just be a disagreement between brothers. It would mean contradicting the story the entire family had already accepted. And that realization made the upcoming lawyer meeting feel more important than ever. Because if Ryan's version of the story was not accurate, that meeting might be the only chance for the truth to surface before everything moved forward without me. The dinner at Aunt Linda's house should have been one of those quiet family evenings where people shared stories about my father and slowly adjusted to life without him, but instead it turned into the moment when the entire situation around the house shifted from quiet tension to something much more public. I remember the details of that evening clearly because of how normal everything looked at first. Aunt Linda lived about 15 minutes outside Columbus in a small ranch-style house with a long driveway and a backyard that overlooked a wide-open field. She had always been the kind of person who tried to keep family gatherings calm and welcoming, especially after difficult events like funerals. That night the dining table was full. My cousin Mark and his wife Emily were there, along with a couple of my father's longtime friends from the neighborhood. The smell of roasted chicken and potatoes filled the kitchen, and for a while the conversation stayed focused on ordinary things like work schedules, local news, and stories about my father that people remembered from years ago. For the first half of the evening nothing about the house was mentioned at all. Then sometime after dinner when people were carrying their plates into the kitchen and refilling their glasses of iced tea, Ryan casually brought the subject up again. He leaned back in his chair and said that the lawyer meeting was scheduled for the following week and that everything with the estate paperwork should be finalized soon. The way he said it sounded confident, almost relieved. Aunt Linda asked what that meant for the house now that things were almost settled. Ryan answered the question in a way that immediately shifted everyone's attention. He said that once the paperwork was complete he was planning to explore selling the property within the next year. The room grew noticeably quieter when he said that. Selling the house where my father had lived for nearly 30 years was not something anyone expected to hear so casually. Aunt Linda set down the dish she was holding and asked if he was sure that was what Dad would have wanted. Ryan explained that the property value in that neighborhood had increased a lot in recent years and that holding on to an aging house could eventually become more expensive than it was worth. He spoke calmly, almost like someone presenting a practical business decision. Then he said something that turned the conversation directly toward me. He looked across the table and said that if he did sell the house he would make sure I received a fair portion of the money from the sale. The way he phrased it sounded polite, but the implication was clear to everyone sitting there. Ryan was the one who would decide what happened to the house. I was simply someone who might receive compensation afterward. I remember the moment that realization settled across the room. No one said anything immediately. Mark glanced down at the table like he was trying to avoid getting involved. Emily quietly sipped from her glass. Aunt Linda hesitated before speaking again, and when she did her voice sounded cautious. She said she assumed the lawyer had already confirmed that the property belonged to Ryan. Ryan nodded slowly and said that everything was basically in place and the upcoming meeting was just to finalize the legal details. Listening to that exchange felt strange in a way that is difficult to describe. It was not anger that I felt at first. It was the awareness that the entire room now believed something had already been decided. Without my participation. Ryan had presented the situation so confidently that everyone accepted it as fact. I remember realizing in that moment how powerful a simple narrative can be when it is repeated often enough. Ryan had been telling the same story for weeks. He had explained that Dad intended for him to take responsibility for the house. He had spoken with the lawyer privately. He had described the upcoming meeting as a formality. By the time we all sat at Aunt Linda's dining table, the conclusion already felt established. The house belonged to Ryan. I sat there quietly for a few seconds after Ryan finished speaking. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention shifting slightly in my direction, as if people expected me to respond. But I did not. Instead I nodded slowly and took a sip of water. I told myself that creating an argument in the middle of a family dinner would only make things worse. My father had always believed that public confrontations damaged relationships more than they solved problems. So I chose the same response I had chosen before. I stayed calm and said very little. The conversation eventually moved on to other subjects, but the atmosphere around the table had already changed. From that moment forward, everyone in the room understood the situation the same way. Ryan was the one making decisions about the house. Later that evening, as people were leaving, Mark pulled me aside near the driveway and quietly asked if I was all right with everything Ryan had said. I told him the truth. I said I was waiting to see what the lawyer had to say during the meeting next week. Mark nodded and said that made sense. But the look on his face suggested he believed the outcome had already been decided. Driving home that night, I kept replaying the dinner conversation in my mind. The public nature of what Ryan said had changed the entire dynamic. If the lawyer meeting confirmed Ryan's version of the story, then the matter would be settled and the house would eventually be sold. But if Ryan was wrong about something, that dinner might also become the moment everyone realized they had accepted the wrong story all along. And for the first time since my father passed away, I began to wonder whether the truth about that house might be more complicated than anyone in my family realized. The drive home after that dinner at Aunt Linda's house stayed on my mind longer than I expected. Normally when something uncomfortable happens during a family gathering, the feeling fades after a day or two. But this time it did not. Ryan's words about selling the house kept replaying in my head, not because the idea itself was shocking, but because of the confidence behind it. He had spoken like someone who already knew exactly how the story would end. And the more I thought about that, the more something about it started to feel slightly off. For the next few days I tried to focus on normal routines. I went to work, ran errands, and stayed busy enough that I did not dwell too much on the situation. Still, every once in a while my thoughts would drift back to the house and the conversation we had all heard around that dinner table. My father had always been a careful man when it came to planning things. He kept records for everything. Insurance documents, tax files, receipts for home repairs going back 20 years. He believed in keeping things organized because he said it prevented confusion later. That was one of the reasons the story Ryan was telling did not sit comfortably with me. If my father had truly intended for Ryan to take full control of the house, it seemed strange that he had never mentioned it to me directly. That thought stayed in the back of my mind until something unexpected happened 3 days later. It was a Tuesday afternoon and I had just finished work when my phone rang. The number on the screen belonged to a local office I did not immediately recognize. When I answered, a woman introduced herself as Melissa from Jonathan Harris's law office. She spoke politely and said she was calling to confirm the appointment Ryan had scheduled for the following week. I told her I was aware of the meeting and that I planned to attend. There was a brief pause before she asked a question that caught me off guard. She asked whether I had ever visited the bank safety deposit box that my father maintained. For a moment I did not know what she meant. I told her I was not aware that my father had a safety deposit box at the bank. Melissa sounded slightly surprised when I said that. She explained that according to the records their office had, my father had maintained a small safety deposit box at First National Bank for several years. Then she asked if I had received the key that was supposed to be passed to me. I remember standing still in my kitchen when she said that. I told her I had never received any key and had no knowledge of the box she was describing. Melissa hesitated for a moment before saying something else that made the situation even more confusing. She said that according to a note attached to my father's legal file, the key had been given directly to me about a year earlier. After that sentence there was a long pause on the phone while both of us tried to make sense of the information. I told her again that I had no memory of receiving any key connected to a bank box. She said that was all right and that we could discuss it further during the meeting next week. Before ending the call she simply suggested that if I happened to remember anything about the key, I should bring it with me. After I hung up the phone, I stood there for a few minutes trying to process what I had just heard. The idea that my father had a safety deposit box was not surprising by itself. Many people keep important documents in places like that. What confused me was the claim that he had given the key to me personally. I started thinking back through the past year, trying to recall any moment when my father might have handed me something important. At first nothing came to mind. My father had always been straightforward when he gave instructions or passed along responsibility. If he had given me a key connected to legal paperwork, it seemed unlikely that he would have done it without explaining why. But later that evening, as I was cleaning out a small drawer in my living room desk, something suddenly resurfaced in my memory. About 11 months before my father passed away, I had stopped by the house on a Sunday afternoon to help him fix a loose board on the back porch. After we finished the repair, we sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things like work and the upcoming football season. Just before I left, my father handed me a small white envelope. I remembered asking him what it was for. He smiled slightly and said something that seemed vague at the time. He said, "Just keep this somewhere safe. You may need it someday." I asked if I should open it and he shook his head. He told me it was not important right now and that I would understand later. At the time I did not think much about it. My father occasionally gave small items like spare keys or paperwork to family members for safekeeping. I put the envelope in my desk drawer when I got home and eventually forgot about it. Standing there in my kitchen after the phone call from the lawyer's office, I suddenly realized something important. That envelope might still be exactly where I left it. I walked into the living room, opened the drawer of the desk I rarely used, and began sorting through old mail and folders until I found it. The envelope was still sealed. The paper had slightly yellowed at the edges from sitting there for months. For a moment I just stared at it, remembering my father's calm expression when he handed it to me that afternoon. At the time it had seemed like a simple request. Now it felt like a piece of a much larger puzzle that I had never bothered to examine. Slowly I opened the envelope and looked inside. What I saw there made me realize that the story surrounding my father's house might not be as straightforward as Ryan believed. I stood there in the kitchen holding that small envelope for several seconds before I finally looked inside. The first thing I saw was a small brass key taped carefully to a folded piece of paper. The key looked exactly like the kind used for safety deposit boxes at banks. That alone would have been enough to make the moment feel significant, but it was the folded paper underneath it that really caught my attention. I unfolded it slowly and recognized my father's handwriting immediately. He had always written in neat, deliberate letters, the kind of handwriting that looked almost like it belonged in a ledger. The note was short. It simply said, "Daniel, if anything happens to me, take this key to the safety deposit box at First National Bank. Do not forget to bring Ryan with you when you speak to the lawyer. Everything will make sense when the time comes." I read the sentence twice before setting the paper down on the kitchen counter. At first it did not seem dramatic. There was no explanation, no detailed instructions, just that one message. But the more I looked at the key and the note together, the more the situation began to feel different from what I had assumed all along. My father had clearly intended for me to have access to that box. More importantly, he had written that instruction nearly a year before he passed away. That meant whatever was inside that safety deposit box had been placed there deliberately and well in advance. The timing mattered. Up until that moment I had believed Ryan's explanation that the house situation was already understood and that the lawyer meeting would simply confirm the arrangement. But now there was a new piece of the story that Ryan had never mentioned. I placed the key back on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table trying to think through what it might mean. One possibility was simple enough. The box might contain nothing more than additional paperwork connected to my father's estate. Many people keep legal documents in safety deposit boxes, especially things like insurance policies or property records. If that was the case, the discovery might not change anything at all. But another possibility kept pushing its way into my thoughts. What if the box contained documents Ryan had not mentioned because he did not know about them? That idea alone made the situation feel more complicated than it had before. Before I could think too much further about it, my phone rang again. This time it was Ryan. His timing felt almost too precise, as if he had somehow sensed that something had changed. When I answered, his voice sounded slightly tense. He asked if I had received the call from the lawyer's office confirming our meeting next week. I told him yes and that the appointment was still on my calendar. There was a short pause before he continued speaking. Then he said something that immediately shifted the tone of the conversation. He asked if I had already gathered the documents I needed to bring to the meeting. I told him I was not sure what documents he meant. Ryan explained that the lawyer would probably ask both of us to sign some paperwork related to the property transfer and the estate closure. Then he added that signing quickly would make the entire process much easier for everyone involved. His words sounded calm on the surface, but there was a subtle pressure behind them. The way he emphasized the importance of finishing the paperwork quickly made me wonder whether he was trying to move things forward before any new questions could appear. I asked him what kind of paperwork he expected us to sign. Ryan hesitated for a moment before answering. Then he said it was most likely just a confirmation that he would be taking responsibility for the house moving forward. Hearing him say that while the key from my father's envelope sat on the kitchen counter in front of me created a strange contrast in my mind. Ryan was speaking as though the decision had already been made. But the existence of that safety deposit box suggested there might still be something we had not seen yet. I did not tell Ryan about the envelope during that call. Instead, I simply said that I would review whatever documents the lawyer presented during the meeting. Ryan seemed unsatisfied with that answer. He repeated that signing everything quickly would prevent unnecessary delays. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he wanted the situation finalized as soon as possible. Eventually the conversation ended with Ryan reminding me about the meeting time again. After I hung up the phone, the house grew quiet. I sat there for a long time looking at the key and the note from my father. The memory of his voice when he handed me that envelope a year earlier came back with unusual clarity. He had said I might need it someday. At the time it sounded like a simple precaution. Now it felt like something more deliberate. The next morning I decided to visit the bank before the lawyer meeting took place. I drove to the First National branch my father had used for years, the same small brick building he once brought me to when I opened my first checking account as a teenager. Inside the lobby everything looked familiar, from the polished tile floors to the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above the teller counters. I walked up to the front desk and explained that my father had maintained a safety deposit box there and that I believed I had the key. The employee at the desk asked for identification and then checked their records. After a few minutes she returned and confirmed that the box was still registered under my father's name with authorized access granted to both of his sons. Hearing that detail made the situation even more interesting. Ryan had never mentioned the existence of the box. The employee escorted me down a short hallway toward the secure room where the safety deposit boxes were stored. As we walked, I could feel the quiet weight of the moment building in my mind. Whatever was inside that small metal box had been placed there by my father long before any of the recent family conversations began. And for the first time since Ryan started telling everyone that the house was already his responsibility, I began to wonder whether my father had prepared something that might change the entire story. The hallway leading to the safety deposit room at First National Bank felt quieter than the rest of the building, almost like stepping into a place where time slowed down. The employee guiding me down the corridor introduced herself as Karen and explained the standard process for accessing a safety deposit box. Her tone was calm and professional, the kind of voice people develop after repeating the same instructions hundreds of times. She told me that since the box was registered under my father's name with authorized access listed for both of his sons, I would be allowed to open it as long as I had proper identification and the key. I nodded and handed over my driver's license along with the small brass key my father had placed inside that envelope nearly a year earlier. Karen examined the key briefly and then opened a secure door at the end of the hallway that led into the vault room. Inside, the temperature felt slightly cooler and the air carried that faint metallic scent common in places filled with rows of steel lockboxes. The walls were lined with hundreds of small drawers arranged in precise rows, each one marked with a small engraved number. Karen located the box connected to my father's account and inserted the bank's master key into the lock beside the one meant for mine. She explained that both keys had to be used together in order to open the box. When she finished unlocking it, she gently pulled the narrow metal drawer out and placed it on a small table in the center of the room. Then she stepped back and told me she would give me privacy while I reviewed the contents. I watched as she left the room and quietly closed the door behind her. For a few seconds I just stood there looking at the box resting on the table. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 12 inches wide and about 6 inches deep. But somehow it carried a sense of importance simply because my father had chosen to store something inside it long before any of the recent family conversations began. I sat down at the table and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were several items carefully arranged in a manila envelope along with a few loose papers. The first thing I noticed was a folded legal document stamped with an official seal from the county clerk's office. Beneath that document was another envelope containing what appeared to be copies of property records. I took the top document out first and unfolded it carefully. Even before reading the full text, I recognized the heading printed across the top of the page. It was a legal amendment related to the deed of my father's house. My heart started beating a little faster as I continued reading. The document had been signed by my father and notarized almost 2 years earlier. It described a specific condition attached to the ownership of the property after his passing. According to the amendment, the house would initially be placed under shared ownership between both of his sons. However, there was an additional clause written several paragraphs below that changed everything. The clause explained that if either son attempted to sell the property without the written consent of the other, the full ownership of the house would automatically transfer to the brother who had not initiated the sale. I read that sentence twice before lowering the document back onto the table. For several seconds I simply stared at the page, letting the meaning settle into my thoughts. My father had clearly anticipated the possibility that one of us might try to sell the house too quickly. Instead of leaving the decision entirely open, he had created a safeguard designed to keep the property within the family unless both of us agreed. That alone was surprising enough, but another detail made the situation even more significant. Attached to the amendment was a record showing that Ryan had already contacted a real estate agent 3 weeks earlier to discuss preparing the house for sale. The document included a preliminary agreement that Ryan had signed indicating his intention to move forward with listing the property once the estate paperwork was finalized. That meant the clause my father wrote could potentially be triggered the moment Ryan attempted to proceed with that plan. Sitting there in the quiet vault room, I suddenly understood why my father might have chosen to leave the key with me instead of Ryan. He wanted both of us to know about the clause, but he also wanted to ensure that the information could not be quietly ignored. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. For the first time since my father passed away, the story surrounding the house no longer felt like something that had already been decided. Instead it felt like something waiting to unfold. A few minutes later Karen returned to the room and asked if I was finished reviewing the contents. I nodded and slid the envelope back into the metal drawer. She locked the box again using both keys and escorted me back toward the front lobby. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, the weight of what I had just read stayed firmly in my mind. The lawyer meeting with Ryan was still scheduled for the following week. Until that moment I had assumed the meeting would simply confirm the arrangement Ryan had been describing for weeks. Now I understood that the meeting might reveal something very different. And the most surprising part was that Ryan might not even realize the truth was about to surface. The morning of the lawyer meeting arrived with a strange sense of calm that I did not expect. Normally when something important is about to happen there is a feeling of tension building throughout the day, but that morning felt unusually quiet. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table looking out the window while the sun slowly came up over the neighborhood. The envelope containing the documents from the safety deposit box was sitting beside my coffee mug. I had reviewed the papers twice the night before just to be certain I understood what they meant. The amendment my father had signed was clear. The house was meant to remain shared property unless both Ryan and I agreed to sell it together. And if either one of us tried to move forward with a sale without the other's consent, ownership would automatically transfer to the brother who had not initiated the sale. It was a simple condition, but it completely changed the story Ryan had been telling everyone. I finished my coffee, placed the envelope inside a leather folder, and drove toward the office of Jonathan Harris. The building was located downtown in a modest brick structure that housed several small legal practices. When I arrived, Ryan was already standing near the entrance checking something on his phone. He looked up as I approached and gave me a quick nod. His expression carried the same confidence I had seen for weeks. To him, this meeting was probably just a final step before everything became official. We walked inside together and checked in with the receptionist. A few minutes later we were led into a conference room where Mr. Harris was waiting for us. The room was quiet and neatly organized, with a long wooden table in the center and several folders arranged carefully near the lawyer's seat. Mr. Harris greeted both of us politely and invited us to sit down. For the first part of the meeting the conversation followed the same predictable path Ryan had described earlier. The lawyer reviewed basic estate details and confirmed that my father's financial accounts had already been distributed according to the will. Ryan listened patiently, occasionally nodding as if everything being said matched exactly what he expected. Then Mr. Harris reached for another folder and placed a document on the table in front of us. His tone shifted slightly as he explained that there was an additional amendment related to the property that needed to be addressed before the estate could be fully closed. I watched Ryan's reaction carefully when the lawyer said that. At first he simply leaned forward and glanced at the document without much concern. Mr. Harris began reading through the amendment slowly, explaining that my father had made a legal adjustment to the property deed 2 years earlier. He described the shared ownership arrangement between the two of us and then paused briefly before continuing to the next section. The room grew noticeably quieter as he reached the clause about selling the house. When he finished reading it aloud, he looked up at both of us to confirm that we understood the terms. Ryan frowned slightly and asked what that clause meant in practical terms. Mr. Harris answered in a calm professional voice. He explained that if either brother attempted to sell the property without the written agreement of the other, ownership of the house would automatically transfer to the brother who had not initiated the sale. Ryan's expression changed in a way I had not seen before. The certainty he had carried into the meeting seemed to fade almost instantly. He asked the lawyer whether that clause had ever been activated. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses and opened another file on the table. Then he explained that according to the documentation he had received from a local real estate agent, Ryan had already signed a preliminary listing agreement expressing his intent to sell the property once the estate process was complete. The moment those words left the lawyer's mouth, the entire room went silent. Ryan leaned back in his chair looking stunned. He started to explain that the listing agreement had only been exploratory and that no official sale had been finalized yet. Mr. Harris nodded and said he understood that. However, he also explained that the language in the amendment was very specific. The clause was triggered by the attempt to initiate a sale without the written consent of the other owner. Since no such consent had been given, the condition described in the amendment had already taken effect. Ryan looked across the table at me as if trying to understand how the situation had shifted so quickly. Mr. Harris closed the file and calmly delivered the final clarification. Under the terms established by our father's amendment, the ownership of the house had automatically transferred to me the moment Ryan attempted to move forward with the listing agreement. The house that Ryan believed he controlled was no longer his responsibility to manage or sell. For several seconds no one said anything. The confidence Ryan had shown for weeks seemed to collapse under the weight of the information now sitting on the table between us. And in that quiet room, surrounded by the documents my father had prepared years earlier, the story everyone believed about the house finally began to unravel. For a long moment after the lawyer finished speaking, the room stayed completely silent. The kind of silence that feels heavier than any argument. Ryan was still leaning back in his chair, staring at the document on the table as if reading it again might somehow change the words printed there. I did not say anything right away either. Part of me was still processing the reality of what had just happened. For weeks the entire family had believed that Ryan was the one who would control the future of the house. He had spoken about repairs, property values, and even selling the place like the decision already belonged to him. And now, in the span of a few sentences from our father's lawyer, the entire situation had reversed. Mr. Harris closed the folder containing the amendment and folded his hands calmly on the table. His tone remained professional and steady, the same way it had been since the beginning of the meeting. He explained that the clause my father added to the property deed was legally binding and had been properly recorded with the county 2 years earlier. That meant the transfer of ownership triggered by Ryan's listing agreement was not something that could simply be undone by changing plans now. The condition had already taken effect. Ryan finally broke the silence by asking whether there was any way to reverse the clause if he withdrew the listing agreement immediately. Mr. Harris shook his head gently and explained that the wording of the amendment was very specific. The moment an attempt to sell the property without the consent of the other brother was made, ownership automatically transferred. The clause did not require the sale to be completed. The attempt itself was enough. Hearing that explanation seemed to settle the reality of the situation for everyone in the room. Ryan looked down at the table for several seconds without speaking. I could see the frustration on his face, but it was mixed with something else too. Confusion. The story he had built over the past several weeks had suddenly collapsed under the weight of a document he did not even know existed. Eventually he let out a quiet breath and leaned forward again. This time when he spoke, his voice sounded different. Less certain than before. He asked me directly whether I had known about the amendment before the meeting. I answered honestly and told him that I had only discovered it a few days earlier after opening the safety deposit box Dad had left instructions about. Ryan blinked slowly when he heard that. Apparently he had never been told about the box at all. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Mr. Harris gathered the remaining paperwork on the table and explained that the estate process could now move forward under the updated ownership status. Since the property had transferred to me under the conditions of the amendment, any future decisions regarding the house would now be mine to make. The meeting ended shortly after that. Ryan left the office first without saying much else, and I stayed behind for a few minutes to review the final documents with Mr. Harris. When I finally stepped outside onto the sidewalk, the afternoon air felt surprisingly calm. Cars moved slowly through the downtown streets and people walked past the building without any awareness that something significant had just unfolded inside that small conference room. I stood there for a moment thinking about my father. The more I reflected on what had happened, the more I realized how carefully he had planned everything. He had not simply left the house to one son or the other. Instead he created a condition that revealed something important about both of us. Ryan had assumed control of the situation and moved quickly towards selling the property. I had stayed quiet longer, trying to understand what our father intended before making any decisions. The amendment he wrote did not reward one personality over the other directly. It simply created consequences based on our choices. Over the next several weeks the situation slowly settled. Some family members were surprised when they learned what had happened. Others admitted they had never fully understood why Ryan seemed so certain about controlling the house in the first place. Aunt Linda called me one evening and said she believed my father probably knew the brothers he raised better than anyone else. Ryan and I did not speak much during that time. There was no dramatic argument or confrontation. Just distance while both of us adjusted to the reality of what had changed. Eventually he reached out and we had a quiet conversation about everything that had happened. It was not an easy discussion, but it was honest. As for the house itself, I decided not to sell it. At least not now. Every room inside that place carries a piece of my father's life and the years our family spent growing up there. The maple tree he planted in the yard is taller than the roof now, and the front porch still creaks the same way it did when we were kids running in and out of the house during summer evenings. Sometimes I sit out there and think about the day he handed me that envelope and told me to keep it safe. At the time I had no idea what it would mean. Now I understand that it was not just about protecting a piece of property. It was about making sure the truth eventually found its way to the surface, even if it took a little time for everyone to see it.